Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to lesson number 3 in our series of lessons about manifest destiny and how the United States expanded from sea to shining sea. Today, we're going to talk about a very difficult and painful chapter in the history of the United States, which is what was the Trail of Tears. This is a very sad chapter in the history of Native Americans in the United States. Overall, we're still trying to answer the essential question, how did the United States expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean? So we're going to start off with the question, who was President Andrew Jackson, besides the guy that you see currently on your $20 bill? Andrew Jackson was the first president born in the United States while it was the United States, and he was the first president from the West. And at that point, Tennessee was considered the West. So he was the first president not from the original 13 colonies and not one of the founding fathers or related to one of the founding fathers. He was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. Because the trimester is short, I have not taught you about the War of 1812. The U.S. fought the British in a second war, the War of 1812, during which the White House was burned. But in the end, the United States won that war against the British, and Andrew Jackson was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, which actually took place after the war was technically over, but they didn't know the war was over yet because news had not reached them. So there is a very prominent statue of Andrew Jackson in New Orleans at a place called Jackson Square, because he routed the British at the Battle of New Orleans, which is where he made his name. He narrowly lost the election of 1824 to John Quincy Adams amid controversy. That is the one time in the history of the country where the president was actually chosen by the House of Representatives because the Electoral College was not determinative, and there was not actually an electoral college majority that elected a president. So it defaulted to the House of Representatives, and from the perspective of Andrew Jackson, the House of Representatives made a corrupt bargain to make John Quincy Adams president, who was the son of former President John Adams. And 4 years later, Andrew Jackson came back to defeat John Quincy Adams. And he was helped by the fact that between 1824 and 1828, the voting laws in many states were changed to no longer require men who owned land to vote. So they simply expanded the vote to all male citizens, which meant that a lot more people got to vote in the election of 1828, and it changed the composition of the electorate. 3 times as many people voted in 1828 as did in 1824, so that obviously changed who voted and how they voted. And so in 1828, Andrew Jackson was overwhelmingly elected president, and he was the first populist president, the first president who really tried to appeal to the feelings and emotions of the average person rather than wealthy, landowning white males. So he appealed to the common man over the educated and wealthy elites, whereas previous presidents pretty much appealed to the educated and wealthy elites. So that's your background on President Andrew Jackson, one of the more colorful and controversial figures in the history of the United States. And there's a reason we're talking about him. So let's talk about the situation of the Native Americans in the southeastern part of the United States. We've talked kind of globally about Native Americans, so now we're going to focus on a specific region. And if you go ahead and look at that map, you will see the native lands that belong to all of those tribes. And I'm not going to go ahead and list every single one of those tribes, but you can see there's roughly 15 tribes that inhabited the southeastern part of the United States, and it's quite frankly, it was a lot more than that. These were the major, larger tribes that inherited that area, and that area is now pretty much the American South. From the beginning of European colonization of America, there had always been conflict with Native Americans. Europeans essentially simply viewed Native Americans as being in the way, didn't treat them with respect, didn't respect the fact that the land had always been theirs, pretty much didn't want to have to see them, deal with them, or relate to them. And so the idea was, let's just push them off the land and make them move farther west. And the natives are like, this is our land. This has always been our land. Land can't belong to anybody. There's no magical line drawn on the ground that says that that's yours and this is mine. The natives literally didn't understand. Their culture was radically different, and they were basically seen as a threat and being in the way. Many native tribes actually tried to become quote-unquote civilized, and by that I mean simply acting more American, acting more European, so that the Americans wouldn't feel as threatened by them. And they tried to mimic American culture, but that's difficult. They were essentially trying not to be who they were to make other people who wanted to take their land more comfortable, and they hoped that by trying to imitate Americans, the Americans would feel less threatened by them, and that simply didn't work, and in so doing, they had to compromise themselves and compromise their culture. So, despite all of their attempts to act like Americans and make Americans more comfortable with them, many Americans simply wanted them out of the way so that they could take their land and pretend that they were never there. And I don't enjoy saying that, but the fact of the matter is that was the attitude at the time in the early 1800s, and we just have to be honest about that. Andrew Jackson was an advocate for relocating the Native Americans so that Americans could take that land and do with it what they wanted. And he had some very strong opinions. This is a quote from Andrew Jackson. "By persuasion and force they have been made to retire from river to river and from mountain to mountain until some of the tribes have become extinct and others have left but remnants to preserve for a while their once terrible names." So he's saying that the names of the Native American tribes were terrible and that they're slowly going extinct and having to move away. And to him, that's a good thing. Surrounded by the whites with their arts of civilization, which by destroying the resources of the savage doom him to weakness and decay. So it's essentially saying, they're surrounded by Europeans and Americans who have much better culture, and so they're doomed to destruction. So he basically has an extraordinarily racist and degrading attitude towards Native Americans. And he said this in 1829 when he was the newly elected President of the United States. So a couple years into his administration, there was an act passed by Congress. Remember, act is a vocabulary word. So our essential question is, what was the Indian Removal Act of 1830? The name of the bill probably gives you a clue where this is going. President Jackson appealed to a popular desire to relocate natives further west. And keep in mind, if you're relocating natives, first of all, you're taking them off their ancestral lands. Secondly, you're moving them to a different area with a different climate and therefore requiring of them an entirely different lifestyle, different crops, different weather. Everything would be different. So this isn't just like, we'll just give you some other land. You know, you can see where this is going. These are the names of the tribes. The Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole tribes still had quite a bit of population in the southeast. So we're talking the states of Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, those areas. This is the areas we're talking about. And basically white settlers wanted to move in and take those lands and create farmland there themselves, and they saw these tribes as being in the way. In 1830, Congress passed and President Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. And basically what this act did is gave the government the power to make treaties with the natives and move them west. So we talked about treaties in the previous lesson. Basically what they were trying to do here was use treaties as a way to legally bind the natives to have to agree to certain rules and move. And so this bill directed the government to make those treaties. One thing the bill did not do is authorize the use of military force to make the Native Americans leave their ancestral lands and force them to move west. The Supreme Court actually ruled in 1831 that Native Americans had a right to keep their land. So the Supreme Court took a stand, said, no, this law is unconstitutional. Native Americans cannot be made to leave their ancestral lands. You must respect their land rights. However, President Jackson openly defied the Supreme Court, which is one of the few times in American history this has happened. And I believe his exact quote was, "Last time I checked, the Supreme Court does not command the U.S. military, and I do." And so President Jackson ignored the court, and he used the U.S. military to force Native Americans off of their ancestral lands and to move west. And this is why President Jackson is a very controversial figure in American history. What was the Trail of Tears? If you go ahead and look at that map in the upper right-hand corner, it is going to show you the relocation. And basically, under the Indian Removal Act, most of the native tribes of the Southeast, so here we're in Georgia, I'm circling Georgia, here we're in Alabama and Mississippi, down here we are in Florida. Those are the areas where the Native Americans were, and they were all being forced into areas in what is now known as Oklahoma. And I'll be completely straight up with you, Oklahoma was considered the least desirable land that nobody wanted at the time, and that's why Native Americans were being moved there. And it had a radically different climate than Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi. So the natives were being moved to some place completely unfamiliar with a completely different climate that was considered much less desirable. Over the 10-year period after the Indian Removal Act was passed, the natives of the Southeast were coerced or forced at gunpoint by the U.S. military to leave their ancestral lands and move to what was called Indian Territory. Most of the state of Oklahoma was once known as and referred to Indian Territory. And Oklahoma was the third to last state in the lower 48 states to join the Union. It was Oklahoma, and then many years later, New Mexico and Arizona. Thousands of Native Americans died along the trail as they were forced to march on foot, sometimes with only what they could carry on their back, to a land that was totally different, more miserable, and completely unfamiliar to them. So this picture here represents natives literally being forced at gunpoint to leave their homes. And if you look at this map here, it shows the route the Cherokee took, the Choctaw took, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Seminole. It shows the routes they were forced to take. So you take a look at that. Many Americans knew that this was happening, and many Americans were ashamed of the actions of their government, and they knew that it was a cruel and deep moral failure. So this was not universally supported by all Americans, but it was strongly supported by Andrew Jackson. It was strongly supported by the American government, because President Jackson was head of the American government. Obviously, it wasn't supported by the Supreme Court, but President Jackson also had majorities in Congress for the Democratic Party, and he was really the first actual Democratic president. Don't get too wrapped up in that, though, because the policies and beliefs of the Democratic Party in the year 2021 are radically different than the policies and the beliefs of the Democratic Party in 1830. There's like 200 years of history difference there. So Andrew Jackson finally left office in 1837, and he was extraordinarily proud of the fact that he had solved the quote-unquote Indian problem. Thousands and thousands and thousands of Native Americans simply died on this trail, which is why it is called the Trail of Tears. It was a trail of death, it was a trail of shame, and it was a trail of pain. To this very day, Andrew Jackson is an extraordinarily controversial president. President Trump had a painting of Andrew Jackson hanging behind his desk in the Oval Office, whereas there is now a move to remove Andrew Jackson from the $20 bill and replace him with Harriet Tubman. That is expected to happen within the next few years. So, as of right now, it is the official U.S. government policy to remove President Jackson from the $20 bill and replace him with a civil rights hero. So I will allow you to make your own judgment as to how you feel about that. So this is another sad chapter. I've taught you a few sad chapters in a row, but they are important chapters. It's important for you to write a summary. I always want 5 to 8 sentences. In your summary, you should answer the following questions, and if you do, you will have a good summary. Who was Andrew Jackson? Who were the natives of the Southeast? Why did President Jackson want to relocate the Native Americans? And what were the consequences of the Indian Removal Act? If you answer those questions in your summary, you will have a very effective summary. Sorry to have to teach you the aspects of history that don't make us feel particularly good about ourselves, but history is about being honest, and history is sometimes about being a little bit uncomfortable. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, this is once again Mr. Blumendahl signing off on the Waldo Middle School Social Studies YouTube network.